The CEO towed a single dad's truck 1 hour later. Her entire board begged him to speak. The old pickup truck had barely left the ground before the young CEO turned away. She didn't look at the man standing in the rain, not once. To her, he was nothing. A stranger in a worn shirt who had wandered too close to a world that wasn't his. But 60 minutes later, the executive boardroom of one of Seattle's most powerful companies fell into a silence so heavy it could break glass. A $400 million production system was failing in real time, and the only person on Earth who understood its core architecture was the man she had just humiliated in front of his 6-year-old daughter. Would her pride destroy the company before the quiet, single father chose to walk back through that door? Seattle in November didn't offer forgiveness. The sky came down in thick gray curtains, and the streets outside Nexurion Dynamics' headquarters reflected the kind of cold light that made everything look like it was already over. The building itself stood 42 stories above the financial district, a glass tower that caught no warmth from the November clouds, but gave the impression by design that it didn't need any. Grace Holloway stepped out of the Blacktown car at 7:52 in the morning, and the world seemed to adjust itself around her. She was 27 years old and had been named CEO of Nexurion Dynamics 8 months earlier, making her the youngest chief executive in the company's 31-year history. Her coat was charcoal gray and tailored to a precision that telegraphed exactly the kind of authority she had spent her entire adult life building. 2 assistants flanked her. A third was already holding the lobby door. She did not pause. She did not look at the sky. She moved the way people who have never been made to wait tend to move, with the assumption that the world arranges itself in their direction. Behind her, 2 members of the financial press exchanged glances. Carter Whitmore, the 63-year-old founder of Nexurion and its current board chairman, watched from behind the tinted glass of the lobby. He had been watching Grace for 8 months, with the kind of careful attention that never announced itself. She was brilliant. That was beyond question. But brilliant, Carter had learned over 31 years of building things, was never enough on its own. The truck arrived at 8:03. It was a dark blue pickup, at least 12 years old, with a left rear panel that had been repainted slightly off color, and a crack in the passenger side mirror that had been taped together with the kind of careful precision that said the owner knew exactly what he had and worked to keep it. It pulled into the secondary access lane, not the main entrance, and parked in the only open space near the side entrance, a space that technically belonged to visitor overflow for the East Wing loading dock. Dominic Hayes cut the engine and sat for a moment without moving. He was 29 years old, though the last 3 years had written something older into the lines around his eyes. He wore a dark blue button-down shirt, clean, pressed, but clearly not new, and dark slacks that fit well enough to suggest they had once been part of something more formal. On the seat beside him, a small insulated lunch bag sat next to a portable hard drive in a padded case. In the back seat, buckled carefully into a booster seat, with a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, was Ella. She was 6. Her hair was in 2 braids that her father had learned to do himself after 18 months of practice. She had a slight fever, 99.4, that wasn't dangerous, but was enough that he hadn't wanted to leave her alone. He had called 4 different people. None of them could come. So Ella came with him, the way she had come to a lot of places in the past 3 years, quiet and trusting and carrying her rabbit. "We won't be long," Dominic told her. 30 minutes, maybe less." Ella nodded and pressed her rabbit against her cheek. He had a scheduled technical appointment, a formal entry on the facility's operations log, arranged 3 days earlier through the board's administrative office. He carried documentation. He carried the hard drive. He had come to deliver something that several members of the executive team had specifically requested. The security officer at the side entrance looked at him for approximately 4 seconds before stepping in front of the door. He explained calmly that he had a scheduled appointment, provided his name. The officer checked a clipboard and found, after a delay that felt deliberate, that his name did not appear on the current day's approved visitor list. What Dominic did not know was that the administrative update had been routed through Adrian Cole's office and had never been submitted. Grace was already upstairs when one of her exterior security staff radioed in about a man in an old truck who was refusing to leave the secondary access lane. She looked at the security feed without interest and said 4 words: "Have it towed out." Adrian Cole, standing 2 feet behind her, said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that could almost, if you were paying close attention, be called relief. Dominic tried twice more. He asked the security officer to contact the operations department directly. The officer told him that wasn't his job. He asked if he could speak with anyone from the board's administrative team. He was told to call the main line. He explained, evenly, that he had driven 40 minutes in the rain with a sick child and had a hard drive containing system documentation that had been formally requested by senior staff. The officer looked at him the way people look at things that have stopped being their problem and pointed toward the street. The tow truck arrived 7 minutes later. It backed up to Dominic's pickup with the kind of efficiency that signals no room for negotiation. Ella, still in her booster seat in the back, pressed her face against the window. She was too young to understand bureaucracy, but she understood the shape of something being taken the way even children can feel when the world is treating their family as something that doesn't belong. Dominic stepped forward and asked the tow operator to wait. He was calm. His voice didn't rise. He didn't make threats. He held out the padded case with the hard drive and said, one more time, that he had a scheduled appointment with the building's operations team and that a simple phone call to the 12th floor would confirm it. Nobody made the phone call. The tow operator hooked the front axle of the truck and activated the lift. Ella opened the back door of the truck and climbed out, still holding her rabbit. The rain had picked up. The stuffed animal slipped from her small hands in the scramble, landing face down in a shallow puddle on the concrete. Dominic turned immediately, crouched down, and picked it up. He shook the water from it carefully, almost methodically, and pressed it into Ella's hands without saying anything. She held it against her chest and looked up at him. "Daddy," she said quietly, "did we do something wrong?" He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, and then smoothed back a strand of wet hair from her forehead with one hand. "No," he said. "We didn't do anything wrong." He stood up and watched the truck get lifted onto the flatbed. His jaw was still. His hands were at his sides. He did not argue further. He did not raise his voice. He looked at the building, at the Nexurian Dynamics logo, mounted in brushed steel above the main entrance, and he stood, with the kind of stillness that isn't passivity. It's something else, something that looks from a distance, like a man deciding what something is worth to him. What none of the security staff standing outside that morning could have known, what even Grace, watching from the 40th floor without looking twice, would not have understood, was what that logo meant to the man standing in the rain in front of it. Dominic Hayes had spent 3 years, from the age of 23 to 26, inside that building. He had worked 12 and 14-hour days in a back corner office on the 18th floor, with a whiteboard covered in notation that none of his colleagues could fully read, and a desk drawer where he kept a photo of a woman who was no longer alive. He had written the foundational architecture of the logistics intelligence system that Grace was, at that very moment, 40 floors above him, preparing to present to a room full of international investors. He had built the house, and they had changed the locks. Before he turned to go, before he picked up Ella and started walking toward the street to find somewhere warm and dry to wait, he paused. One of the exterior maintenance staff, a man in his 50s, who had worked at Nexurian for 12 years and who had seen Dominic around the building many times years earlier, was standing near the side entrance watching the scene with an expression he couldn't quite hide. Dominic looked at him and said it quietly, almost as an aside. "If Zenith runs into a synchronization error today, don't restart the core layer. Just let it stabilize on its own." The maintenance worker stared at him. Dominic turned and walked away through the rain, holding Ella's hand. Nobody wrote it down. The executive presentation began at 9:15 on the 40th floor. The room was built for exactly this kind of morning floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, a conference table that could seat 22, and a screen system that had cost more than most people's homes. 12 members of the board were present. 3 international investment groups had sent senior representatives, 2 of them flying in overnight from London and Zurich. Carter Whitmore sat at the far end of the table, in the seat he had occupied at every significant company meeting for 31 years, and watched with the quiet attention of a man who built things and understood exactly how they could come apart. Grace stood at the front of the room. She had prepared for this presentation for 6 weeks. Every number was verified. Every projection had been stress-tested by 2 separate analytics teams. The Zenith AI logistics system, Nexurian's flagship product, the technology that had elevated the company from a mid-tier industrial software firm into a genuine global player, was about to be demonstrated live, in real time, to the people who could push its valuation past $400 million. She pulled up the live interface at 9:22. The room watched as the Zenith dashboard populated with data points from the system's active deployment network, 17 distribution hubs across 4 countries, 9,000 smart containers in simultaneous operation, all of it running through a synchronization engine that was supposed to be, by every internal benchmark, impenetrable. At 9:24 and 31 seconds, the first anomaly appeared. It was subtle at first, a small cluster of containers in the Pacific Northwest routing hub, showing a 3-second lag in position sync. One of the analysts in the room dismissed it immediately. "Normal variance," she said. Grace kept her expression neutral and continued talking, but the lag didn't resolve. It widened. At 9:26, the system flagged a secondary anomaly in the European node. At 9:28, the core synchronization layer threw its first hard error, a cascading reset that wiped the real-time positioning data for 412 containers in under 40 seconds. The room went quiet. Grace's lead systems engineer, Marcus Webb, was already at a secondary terminal. His face had gone pale. The error wasn't responding to standard override protocols. The core layer wasn't just resetting, it was entering a loop, resetting, attempting to restore, failing and resetting again. Every cycle wiped another block of synchronized data. At the rate it was going, the entire active deployment network would be offline within 30 minutes. "What is this?" Grace asked, and her voice was controlled, but only technically. Marcus didn't answer. He was typing. The investors exchanged looks. The London representative leaned forward and said something quietly to the man beside him. Carter Whitmore had not moved, but the quality of his stillness had changed. He was watching Grace the way he always watched people when things went wrong. Not with judgment, not yet, but with the kind of attention that records everything. Adrian Cole, standing near the room's secondary entrance, had already taken 2 steps toward the door before stopping himself. He stood very still and said nothing. It took another 4 minutes for Marcus to look up from his terminal with an expression that said he had found something he didn't want to have found. "The synchronization layer," he said. "It's not a standard failure. Something modified the core handoff protocol. The modification is creating a recursive conflict in the mirror architecture. The system can't resolve which version of itself is primary." "When was the protocol modified?" Carter asked. His voice was even. Marcus checked the timestamp. He checked it again. 14 days ago. Carter turned to look at Adrian, who had developed a sudden interest in the secondary display screen on the far wall. "Who wrote the original synchronization architecture?" Carter asked. Not to Adrian, to the room. An older engineer, a man named Gerald, who had been with the company for 11 years and who sat in the back row at every meeting because he preferred to observe, looked up from his laptop. "The foundational layer?" Gerald said. "That was Dominic Hayes." The name landed in the room the way names sometimes do when they carry more weight than the people hearing them are prepared for. "He left about 3 years ago," Gerald added. Carter looked at Grace. Grace looked at the screen, where the error counter was still climbing. For a moment, Grace didn't speak. She stood at the head of the table with the weight of the morning settling onto her in a way that had nothing to do with the investors watching her or the numbers on the failing screen behind her. It was something more fundamental, the particular kind of discomfort that arrives when reality refuses to arrange itself the way you've arranged your assumptions. "Dominic Hayes," she repeated. "Yes," Gerald said. He adjusted his glasses and set his laptop carefully on the table. He designed the entire core synchronization system, the mirror architecture, the container handoff protocol, the stability logic. He was essentially the architect of everything Zenith runs on. He worked on it for nearly 3 years. Adrian straightened. His contributions have been thoroughly documented and superseded. The current engineering team has complete ownership of the system's operational layer. One person's historical work doesn't constitute a dependency. Gerald looked at Adrian with the calm expression of a man who has been around long enough to know when someone is lying, and old enough not to bother being polite about it. The core layer hasn't been rewritten, Gerald said. It's been modified, patched, and extended. But the foundational synchronization architecture, that's still his, exactly as he wrote it. We've never fully replaced it because nobody here has ever fully understood all of it. The silence in the room shifted. Carter leaned back slightly in his chair. You're telling me that the system we're about to sell to international investors for a 9-figure sum runs on a core architecture that our current engineering team doesn't fully understand? Gerald said nothing. He didn't need to. Grace pressed her fingers flat against the table. She was running the conversation backward in her mind. The rain, the secondary access lane, the old truck, the worn shirt, the man who had held a padded hard drive case and spoken calmly to a security officer who hadn't listened. She had watched that on a monitor for approximately 3 seconds before dismissing it. She had ordered his truck towed. There's something else, Gerald said quietly. He had pulled up a directory on his screen. Before Mr. Hayes left the company, there was a security incident, an allegation that certain proprietary materials had been accessed without authorization. It was the basis for his termination, Adrian said, which was fully investigated, and I reviewed the investigation file last year, Gerald said. The access logs cited in the report were timestamped outside of Mr. Hayes' normal working pattern. The authorization credentials used didn't match his standard access profile. I flagged it internally. Nothing was done. The room was very quiet. Grace looked at Adrian. Adrian was looking at the secondary display screen again. The allegation was what removed him from the project, Gerald continued. Before that, he had raised several concerns internally about how the system's processing protocols were being adjusted to increase throughput metrics. He believed the adjustments created structural vulnerabilities. He documented his concerns. Those documents were subsequently removed from the shared project archive. Carter's expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had. Grace turned back to the main screen. The error counter had climbed by another 40 units while they were talking. The recursive loop in the core layer was accelerating. Marcus was still typing, still trying protocols that weren't working, his face now carrying the expression of a man who is starting to understand that he is trying to fix something in a language he doesn't speak. Get him back here, Carter said. Grace was already moving toward the door. Find Dominic Hayes, she said to the room. Right now. She was in the elevator before it fully registered what she was doing, that she, Grace Holloway, CEO, was going out personally to find a man she had dismissed as a non-entity less than 2 hours ago. She pressed the lobby button and watched the floors drop. In the reflection of the elevator doors, her face looked like someone she almost didn't recognize. She took her own car. She told no one. She took the keys from her assistant's desk without explaining why, and walked through the lobby and out into the rain, and she drove herself through the financial district, with both hands on the wheel, and the kind of focused silence that had, until recently, only ever applied to spreadsheets and acquisition strategies. She had the tow operator's location from the security log. The impound lot was 11 blocks southeast, in the kind of neighborhood that the financial district faded into smaller buildings, older facades, a tire shop on one corner and a discount pharmacy on the other. The lot was surrounded by a chain-link fence with a small office building attached, its windows fogged from the inside. The blue pickup was there. It sat in the third row, still intact, rain beating on the hood. Seeing it there, ordinary, battered, somehow still dignified in the way that old things kept carefully can be produced a feeling in Grace that she didn't have a clean name for. She found Dominic in the waiting room. It was a narrow space with plastic chairs bolted to the wall, a vending machine in one corner, and a television mounted near the ceiling playing morning news at a volume too low to hear. The linoleum floor had been mopped recently, but not well. A fluorescent light above the door flickered every 30 seconds, with the quiet persistence of something that has given up asking for repair. Dominic was in one of the chairs near the window. Ella was asleep across his lap, her head on his folded jacket, her rabbit tucked under her chin. She was still flushed. Her breathing had the slightly labored quality of a child running a fever, and Dominic had one hand resting lightly on her back, rising and falling with her breath, the way parents do when they're monitoring without making it obvious. With his other hand, he was carefully opening a small prescription bottle, Ella's allergy medication, and working the cap that had partially jammed. He was doing it slowly, so as not to wake her. His fingers were careful, precise. The same hands that had written some of the most complex adaptive logistics code in the industry were working a stuck bottle cap in an impound lot waiting room, because that was what the moment required. Grace stood in the doorway for a moment before he looked up. When he did, his expression didn't change much. There was recognition, a brief flicker of something she couldn't read, and then the same steadiness she had seen and dismissed from 40 floors up. "I need you to come back," she said. He looked at her without hostility. That was almost harder than if he had been angry. "The system is failing," she said. "The synchronization layer. Nobody on the current team can fix it. Gerald Marsh said the architecture is still yours. Every layer of it." "I know," Dominic said. "Then you know what's at stake." "Yes." He adjusted Ella's jacket slightly. "I know what's at stake." Grace stepped fully inside and let the door close behind her. She stood in front of him, no assistance, no tailored coat, no controlled access entry, and said what was true. "I should have let you in this morning. I should have made sure you were on the list. I didn't. That was my failure, not the security staff's. And I had your truck towed, and I didn't look at you once while I did it, and I understand if that matters." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "The company needs you," she said. "And I understand that's not the same thing as me deserving your help." He looked at Ella, sleeping on his jacket. Then he looked at the window, at the rain running down it in long parallel lines. "If Zenith goes down completely," he said, "how many people are on the operational payroll?" 4,200. Not counting the contractor network. He nodded slowly. "Then let's go." He carried Ella against his chest when they left the impound lot, her head resting on his shoulder, still asleep. Grace walked alongside him without speaking. She had stopped trying to fill silence with her voice, which was not something that had ever come naturally to her. The building's lobby, when they returned, registered his presence differently than it had 3 hours earlier. The security officer who had denied him entry was still at the side desk. He made eye contact with Dominic for approximately 1 second, and then found something to look at on his monitor. The lobby staff parted without being asked. Grace did not issue instructions. She didn't need to. They went up in the executive elevator. Ella slept through all of it. The 40th floor operations center was the building's nerve center, 12 workstations, 6 wall-mounted display panels, a real-time relay of every active node in the Zenith network. When Dominic walked through the door, carrying his daughter in one arm and the padded hard drive case in his other hand, the room went quiet. Not gradually. Immediately. 2 of the senior engineers turned in their chairs. Gerald Marsh stood up slowly, almost without appearing to decide to. The gesture had the quality of a reflex, the kind of response the body makes before the mind has finished deciding. Another engineer, a woman in her 30s who had been with the company for 6 years, pressed her lips together and looked back at her screen as though she hadn't moved at all. Marcus Webb, still at the primary terminal, looked up and said nothing. He just moved sideways in his chair. It was one of the most significant gestures in the room that morning. Dominic set Ella down carefully on the long couch against the far wall and arranged his jacket around her. He set his hard drive case on the workstation beside Marcus and looked at the main display. He was quiet for 1 minute and 48 seconds. In that time, he read through 4 separate error logs without touching the keyboard. He looked at the system architecture diagram on the left panel. He looked at the timestamp on the protocol modification. He looked at the recursive loop counter, still climbing. He pulled a small notebook from his back pocket, spiral-bound blue cover, the kind sold at drugstore checkout counters, and wrote 2 lines in it. Then he looked at Marcus, who modified the core handoff protocol 14 days ago. Marcus glanced toward Adrian Cole, who was standing near the door. "There was an efficiency update," Adrian said. "Approved through the optimization review process. It increased throughput by 11%. It changed the resolution priority of the mirror sync layer," Dominic said. "The system's conflict logic is reading both versions of the mirror as primary. Every time it tries to resolve the conflict, it resets and creates a new one. It's not a failure state, it's a loop. The system is doing exactly what it was told to do. You just told it to do something that breaks it." The room was very still. "To stop the loop," Dominic continued, "you need to take the mirror server layer completely offline. Cut the conflict at the source. The core synchronization engine will stabilize on its own within 4 minutes, once the competing signal is gone." A junior engineer near the back said, quietly, "If we take the mirror layer offline and it doesn't stabilize, we lose the entire active network, every node, every container. The investors are still in the building." "I know," Dominic said. "The stock exposure. I know what the exposure is." "Then you understand why we can't just—" "I built this system," Dominic said. Not loudly, not with emphasis, just as a fact. "I know what it does when you give it room to stabilize. I know because I designed the recovery behavior specifically for a scenario like this. It will come back, but only if you stop fighting it." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences before it. Carter Whitmore was standing in the doorway behind Grace. He had followed them up without announcing himself. He looked at Dominic for a moment, at the worn shirt, at the sleeping child on the couch, at the spiral notebook, and he said it simply. "Do what he says." Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds after Carter spoke. Then Marcus reached for the mirror server control panel. The decision to pull a layer of critical infrastructure offline in front of 9-figure investors required, in any normal circumstance, sign-off from 3 separate departments and a written risk assessment. What it got instead was a 63-year-old founder saying 3 words, and a room of experienced engineers choosing to believe in something they couldn't fully measure, which was not the system's architecture, but the man who had built it. Marcus executed the command at 10:41. The display panels went partially dark. 3 of the 6 external node indicators dropped offline simultaneously. The error counter stopped, not climbing, not resolving, just frozen, like something holding its breath. The recursive loop terminated mid-cycle. In the boardroom down the hall, the investors had gone completely silent. Grace stood near the door of the operations center, and she watched. She watched Dominic. He was at the primary workstation, leaning slightly forward, both hands on the edge of the desk. He wasn't typing. He wasn't adjusting anything. He was watching the core synchronization log with the kind of attention that doesn't perform itself, the kind that happens when someone has made their decision and is simply present with what comes next. Ella shifted on the couch. She didn't wake up. She pulled her rabbit closer and made a small sound and went still again. The stuffed animal worn at one ear, slightly discolored from years of being held, rested against her cheek. The counter in the lower right of the main display began to move. Not the error counter. A new one system recovery. Node 1 Pacific Northwest Hub came back online. Then Node 2. The display began populating with green status indicators. Slowly at first, then in clusters, the way light returns to a room when someone finds the breaker. At 10:45 and 33 seconds, the final active node reconnected. The synchronization layer was stable. The boardroom down the hall erupted, not in cheers exactly. It was too professional a room for that, but in the particular sound of people who have been holding their breath releasing it all at once, followed by the immediate noise of relief, translating itself into conversation and movement. The London representative's voice could be heard through the wall. Carter, still in the doorway, closed his eyes briefly and opened them again. Marcus looked at the display for a long moment before turning to say something to Dominic. Whatever he intended to say, he stopped when he saw Dominic's face. Dominic was looking at the screen. Then he was looking at something else, something in the data, in one of the secondary logs that had populated during the recovery sequence. His expression had shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something that wasn't relief. It was recognition, the kind that comes when something you suspected is confirmed by something you can prove. He pulled the spiral notebook back out of his pocket. He wrote something, tore the page out carefully, and placed it face down on the workstation beside the keyboard. Grace had moved from the doorway to a position a few feet behind him. She had been watching him work for the past 22 minutes, and something had happened in that time that she couldn't have articulated cleanly. She had stopped seeing a problem and started seeing a person. The worn shirt and the notebook and the sleeping child on the couch had composed themselves into something that made her feel, with uncomfortable clarity, the difference between the kind of intelligence that announces itself and the kind that simply does what needs to be done. Dominic turned the page over. He had written a series of transaction codes. He looked at Carter. "Before I explain the system recovery," he said quietly, "I think the board needs to see something else." The boardroom reassembled at 11:20. The international investors were still present. The board's 12 members were in their seats. Grace stood to one side, having relinquished the front of the room without ceremony. Carter sat at his usual position at the far end of the table, and the quality of his attention, always precise, had become something closer to absolute. Dominic stood at the presentation terminal. He had refused the offer of a headset and spoke directly, which made the room work harder to listen, and the room did work harder. The synchronization failure this morning wasn't caused by a design flaw in the original architecture, he said. It was caused by a modification to the core handoff protocol made 14 days ago. The modification changed the mirror conflict resolution priority to favor throughput efficiency over synchronization integrity. He paused. That change increased processing speed by 11%. It also created a structural condition that guaranteed a cascade failure under high-load conditions, which is exactly what happened during this morning's live demonstration. He connected the portable hard drive to the terminal. The modification was made using administrative credentials. I've pulled the original access log from this drive. This is the backup copy I made on my last day at the company. The credentials used to make that modification 14 days ago are the same credentials that were used 3 years ago to access project files under my authorization profile and trigger the security flag that was used to justify my termination. Adrian Cole said, "This is absurd." The timestamp on the original security incident, Dominic continued, was 3:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. My badge access records show I was not in the building. The internal CCTV archive, which I requested a copy of at the time and was denied, has since been partially recovered from a backup server. I have 47 seconds of footage from that morning. He brought it up on screen. The footage was grainy. It was old. But the figure at the workstation in question was identifiable, and it was not Dominic Hayes. The figure was thinner, older, moving with the deliberate speed of someone who knows where they're going and why. The room recognized Adrian Cole before anyone said his name. The silence was absolute. Adrian pushed back his chair. "You don't know what you're doing. You came here with a grudge and a hard drive, and you're trying to—" "I have the original transaction log," Dominic said. "I have the system backup from the night of the incident. I have the file access records from the project archive, including the deletion timestamps on my own internal memos, which were removed 4 days after I raised concerns about the protocol adjustments." He looked at Adrian directly. The same protocol adjustments that just almost collapsed a $400 million system in front of every investor in this room. There was a moment in which the room collectively processed what it had just heard and what it meant for everything it thought it understood about the last 3 years. Adrian moved toward the door. 2 members of the building's security team were already in the hallway. They had been called, quietly, before the presentation began. Carter had made one phone call from the operations center doorway, after reading the single page Dominic had torn from his spiral notebook. He had made it without explaining himself to anyone in the room, which was one of the advantages of being the person who built the room. Adrian was escorted out before he reached the elevator. The room watched it happen. Nobody spoke. The door closed. The hum of the building's ventilation system became briefly, strangely audible. Carter looked at the investors, and then at the board, and then at Dominic. "I think," he said, "we have a number of things to discuss." Grace left the boardroom at 12:40, not in the way she usually left rooms with purpose and direction, and a destination already planned. She walked out into the corridor and stood for a moment, with her back against the wall and her hands at her sides, and did nothing. It was a posture that no one on the 40th floor had ever seen from her, which was perhaps why the two assistants who passed her in the hallway didn't immediately recognize her. She walked back to the operations center. Dominic was still there. The main display was stable, all nodes green, the system running the way it was supposed to run, as though the morning had not happened. He was sitting in one of the workstation chairs, and Ella was awake now, sitting sideways on the couch with her rabbit in her lap, eating crackers from the insulated bag her father had packed. She was still flushed. The fever hadn't broken. Grace stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before he looked up. When he did, she came in. She didn't stand the way she'd been standing all morning, with her back straight and her chin up, and the careful performance of authority calibrated for every room she entered. She stood the way people stand when the performance has stopped, which is slightly smaller, slightly less certain, and considerably more real. "You're still working," she said. "Running a diagnostic on the secondary nodes. Shouldn't take long." He glanced at Ella, who had looked up when Grace walked in, and back at the screen. Grace pulled a chair from the nearest workstation and sat down, not at the desk, but facing him, a few feet away, with nothing between them. "Why didn't you tell me who you were this morning?" she said. Dominic kept his eyes on the screen. "You didn't ask. I didn't give you the chance." He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "I saw you on the security feed," she said. 30 seconds, maybe. I decided what you were in 30 seconds without looking at you." She paused. "I've been trying to think of a version of that story where I'm not the problem, and I can't find one." Dominic closed the diagnostic window and turned in the chair. "You were protecting something," he said. "The image, the investors, the morning. I understand what that pressure feels like. I was in this building for 3 years. That's not an excuse." "No," he said. "It isn't, but it's a reason. People make fast decisions about other people when they're under pressure. Usually the decisions favor whoever looks most like them." He leaned back slightly. "The truck doesn't help. It wasn't a joke, exactly. But it was close enough to one that something in Grace's expression shifted." "Why did you come back?" she asked. "After what I did this morning. You could have let it fail. 4,200 people," he said. "And if it had only been the investors at stake?" He thought about that honestly. "I don't know. Maybe I still would have, but it would have taken me longer to get out of the chair." Grace looked at Ella, who had finished her crackers and was now lying back on the couch, watching the ceiling with the philosophical patience of a 6-year-old who has spent a lot of time in adult spaces. Her cheeks were still too pink. "She needs to see a doctor," Grace said. "I know. I was going to go after the diagnostic. You should go now. I can monitor the secondary nodes." Dominic looked at her. "I know the system," Grace said. "Not the way you do. But I've been looking at these dashboards for 8 months. If anything changes, I'll call you." He looked at the screen, then at Ella. "Okay," he said. Carter Whitmore found Dominic in the corridor outside the operations center at 1:15, as he was gathering Ella's things and preparing to leave. The hallway was emptier now. The investors had been moved to a conference suite on the 38th floor, and most of the 40th floor staff had dispersed with the particular stunned energy of people who have witnessed something they'll be processing for weeks. Carter walked with a slight forward lean that had gotten more pronounced in his 60s, the posture of a man who has spent a lifetime inclining toward whatever he wants to understand. "You have a minute?" he said. Dominic looked at Ella, who was walking beside him holding his hand, dragging her rabbit along the floor with the other. 1 minute, he said. Carter nodded and walked with them toward the elevator bank. You know why I never replaced your architecture, he said. It wasn't budget. It wasn't timeline. It was that nobody who came after you could do what you did with the synchronization logic. I've had 3 chief technology officers since you left. All of them intelligent people. All of them working with documentation they couldn't fully interpret. He stopped walking. The system you built at 24 years old is still the only one that works. Dominic pressed the elevator call button. I know, he said. I should have protected you better when Adrian made his move, Carter said. I was focused on protecting the investor relationship. I made a calculation. It was the wrong one. The elevator arrived. Dominic held the door. After your wife passed, Carter said quietly, you were offered a buyout. Significant equity stake. 7 figures. You turned it down. Yes. I've been trying to understand that decision for 3 years. Carter looked at Ella, who had pressed herself against her father's leg and was watching the floor indicator above the elevator doors with great concentration. I think I understand it now. Dominic didn't respond. She needs you, Carter said, and you chose to be available for that, even at the cost of everything else. It wasn't a difficult decision, Dominic said. Carter studied him for a moment with the expression of a man who has spent his life surrounded by people who found everything difficult and was not entirely sure what to do with the alternative. I'd like you to come back, he said. Not in the same capacity. Chief Technology Officer. Restructured role. You'd have direct authority over the architecture team. Nobody touches the core systems without your sign-off. Dominic held the elevator door without getting in. You'd be in a position to prevent exactly what happened today from happening again, Carter continued. Everything Adrian did, the protocol changes, the financial manipulation, the falsified security incident, none of it happens if you're in the room with real authority. I'll think about it, Dominic said. Carter nodded. He understood that from this particular man, those 4 words weren't deflection. They were a genuine statement of intent. Take her to the doctor, he said. He looked at Ella, and his voice, without any apparent effort, became something warmer. What's your rabbit's name? Ella considered this with appropriate seriousness. Professor Rabbit, she said. Carter smiled. It changed his face entirely. That's an excellent name. The elevator doors began to close. Dominic caught them with one hand and held them open for a final moment, and he looked at Carter Whitmore, this man who had built a company over 31 years, who had made wrong decisions and knew it, and was saying so, and something between them settled quietly into place. I'll call you, Dominic said. He stepped in. The doors closed. Carter stood in the corridor and listened to the floor indicator descend. Behind him, Grace had appeared at the entrance to the operations center without making a sound. She had heard the last part of the conversation. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to understand what Carter already knew, which was that the morning's events had not been about a system failure or a board presentation or a man with a portable hard drive and a truck in an impound lot. It had been about what gets buried and what refuses to stay buried, and what it costs everyone in the room when an organization cannot tell the difference between a person's appearance and their value. She stood there for a long moment after the elevator lights stopped moving. Then she went to get her keys. The hospital was a 15-minute drive from the financial district, through the kind of mid-afternoon Seattle traffic that gives people time to think whether they want it or not. Grace drove herself. She had texted Dominic before leaving the building simply the name of the nearest urgent care clinic. Good with pediatric cases, fast intake, and a note that she had already called ahead to put Ella's name on the list. She hadn't asked if it was helpful. She had just done it. She found them in the waiting room. It was a different waiting room than the impound lot office, but not profoundly different. Plastic chairs, fluorescent light, a television in one corner showing afternoon programming. Ella was in a chair beside her father with a paper cup of water and a coloring sheet one of the nurses had given her, coloring a cartoon bear with the focused seriousness of someone who has been told to wait and has decided to be excellent at it. Dominic looked up when Grace came in. He didn't say anything. Neither did she, immediately. She sat down 2 chairs away from him and set her bag on the floor and looked at the coloring sheet and said, "That's a very well-colored bear." Ella looked at her. "His name is Gerald," she said. Grace blinked. "Gerald. He's a doctor bear." Ella held up the sheet for inspection. The bear had been given a stethoscope in dark blue crayon, applied with considerable authority. "That's a very good stethoscope," Grace said. Ella nodded in agreement and went back to coloring. They sat in that silence for a while, the 3 of them, which was an arrangement that would have been entirely incomprehensible at 8 o'clock that morning. Grace looked at the floor. She looked at her hands. She thought about the town car and the tailored coat, and the 4 words she'd said into a radio before going upstairs to present a system she didn't build to people she needed to impress. "I'm sorry," she said. Dominic kept his eyes on the wall in front of him. "For this morning," she said. "The truck. Not listening when you tried to explain yourself. All of it. But mostly," she stopped. She started again. "Mostly for doing it in front of her." "She's resilient," Dominic said. "She shouldn't have to be," Grace said. "Not for something I caused." Ella was called in 15 minutes later. Dominic went with her. Grace stayed in the waiting room and sat with her hands in her lap and the quiet company of the fluorescent light and Dr. Gerald the bear, who had been left behind on the coloring sheet in the adjoining chair. When they came back out, Ella was carrying a small adhesive bandage on her arm, a blood draw for a routine panel, and holding it up for review. "Bravest person in Seattle," Dominic told her. "I know," said Ella. They were heading for the exit when Ella stopped and looked back at Grace. Her expression had the particular directness of 6-year-olds who have not yet learned to obscure honest questions behind socially convenient ones. "Are you still mad at my daddy?" she asked. Grace crouched down so that she was level with Ella. It was not a thing she had planned. She just did it. "No," she said. "I was never mad at your daddy. I just made a mistake. A big one." Ella considered this. "Do you feel bad about it?" "Yes," Grace said. "A lot." Ella nodded, apparently satisfied. "Daddy says that when you feel bad about a mistake, the next step is fixing it." She looked at her rabbit. "He fixes things." Grace looked up at Dominic. He was looking at Ella with an expression that had nothing to do with any of the events of the day. Not the board meeting, or the system failure, or the betrayal, or the recovery. It was purely a father looking at his daughter, with a particular kind of quiet that comes from love that has been tested and hasn't broken. 3 days later, a flatbed truck delivered a dark blue pickup to Dominic's address in the Fremont neighborhood. It had been fully serviced, new brakes, oil changed, rust treated, tires replaced. The passenger side mirror had been repaired properly rather than taped. The interior had been cleaned. In the back seat, secured and carefully assembled, was a new child safety seat Ella's size, in a soft green that she would, it turned out, consider acceptable. On the front seat were 2 envelopes. The first was a formal letter on Nexurian letterhead, outlining the terms of a restructured consulting agreement, no mandatory presence, no rigid hierarchy, full authority over the core systems he'd built, with a compensation offer that acknowledged what 3 years of freelance repair work had cost him. The terms had been written carefully. They gave him room. The second envelope was smaller, personal stationery, handwriting that had clearly spent time on itself. The letter inside was 3 paragraphs long. It did not make excuses. It did not explain the pressure of the board, or the investors, or the 8 months of proving herself in a role she'd been given too young and too fast. It only said what was true, that she had looked at him and seen a category instead of a person, and that the damage done in 30 seconds of assumption had taken the rest of the day to understand, and that she was still understanding it. The last line read, "Professor Rabbit deserves better than a parking lot in the rain. So does his family." Dominic read it twice. Then he set it on the kitchen table and walked to the window that faced the street. The truck sat at the curb in the late afternoon light, freshly painted, new tires on wet pavement. It looked like itself, nothing more, and nothing less. An ordinary vehicle that belonged to a man who fixed things, who raised a daughter alone, who had built something remarkable and walked away from the credit because credit was not what he needed. He stood at the window for a long time. Across the city, the Nexurian Dynamics Tower caught the last light, the way glass towers do, all surface, no interior. But Dominic had been inside it. He knew what it was made of. He knew which systems were truly load-bearing and which were decoration, and he knew that the people inside it were beginning, slowly, to understand the same thing. When Ella came in from the kitchen asking if they were getting takeout for dinner, he turned away from the window. "Yes," he said. "Whatever you want." She wanted dumplings, which was what she always wanted. He got his keys, the old ones, not yet replaced, and walked down to the truck that someone had driven back to him as an act of grace. Nobody from the financial district was watching this time, but then, nobody had needed to be watching for any of it to matter.